Hello, I'm Mark, and this is In the Round, On-Armature bust tutorial series, part 15, finishing and final detailing. Now that the bust is off the armature and reassembled, it's time to consider the nuances of detail and surface finish. Detailing and finishing can be a quick process if you favor a looser, rougher style, which can be quite sculpturally effective, but is trickier to pull off well than most people imagine. If, on the other hand, you're interested in a tighter style with precise detail and pristine finishes, or if you want to attempt realistic skin textures, it can take a very, very long time. As a beginner, it's good to experiment with both tight and loose styles, and to try out realistic skin textures as you settle in towards your preferred style. Here, I will briefly cover all of these options, beginning with detailing the features and moving on to various finishing options. Regardless of the style you choose, it will be necessary to balance areas of higher definition with areas of lower definition. Typically, the most important focal points on a bust are the eyes, followed by the mouth, so we'll begin with these, amplifying the contrast and definition as we sculpt in the finer details. At this point, the eye should already be fairly well developed, and the gaze should be established. If they've been damaged at all in the removal and reassembly process, now is the time to make any necessary repairs. First, check that there's good roundness in the eyeball, delicately carving away or compressing in areas of excess fullness, and working in very small additions in low spots. You can use a small, dry, stiff-bristled brush to work in these additions. Check that the curvature of the eyeball continues smoothly under the lid and that there are no cuts or grooves in its surface. Make sure there's a very sharp, clean transition between the levels of the iris and pupil. You might even amplify these with a very slight ridge along the outer edge of the iris and an incised outline at its inside corner. The sharper these transitions are, the clearer and younger the eyes will appear. So, if you're sculpting older eyes, you might want to leave them a little more diffuse. Define the transitions from the front faces to the edges of the eyelids, remembering that these edges are more planar than round. Bulk up these leading edges with tiny coils if they seem thin. Confirm that their curvature is correct, taking into account the corneal lift. At the lateral angle of the eye, let the upper lid slightly overhang the lower, casting a small shadow. Heightening the contrast here will better define the eyes, making them more of a focal point. The shadow will also read a little like the darkness of eyelashes. You can increase the suggestion of eyelashes by adding a tapered, sharp-edged ridge along the lateral side of the upper lids to increase the shadow's size. You can even carve some deep, sharp grooves into this addition to give it a little eyelash-like texture. These are, of course, lighting-dependent sculptural approximations and will only read as kind of like eyelashes, and only from a distance. At the medial angle, assert the shape of the lacrimal lake. Add a very small volume to its interior to form the lacrimal carbuncle. Formally, this will create a contrasting highlight across from the low-light shadow at the lateral angle. It will also further the illusion that the eyes are wet and shiny. Compress the edge of the lower lid to create a sharply defined plane of caught light. This highlight will outline the eye in formal contrast with the shadow cast beneath the upper lid. Working out from the eyes, check that the crease of the eyelid has good curvature and a nice fleshiness to it with no sharp-edged cuts or facets. You can now build up smaller anatomical features, including furrows at the root of the nose and around the eyebrows. For the majority of the sculpt, we've been working hard to maintain as close to perfect symmetry as possible. But of course, people aren't actually symmetrical. Developing subtle asymmetries will make the figure look more plausibly human, and the furrows around the eyes are a good place to start that process. As with the eyes, the mouth benefits from slightly exaggerated definition and contrast, particularly a little extra depth at the corners and a pronounced lip ridge. The former will create low-light focal points emphasizing the expression of the mouth, while the latter will help to suggest the color change at the vermilion of the lips. First, carve or compress into the corners of the mouth, checking to make sure that they're suggesting the expression you want and that any asymmetries between them are desirable ones. Be careful here not to carve through to the interior of the bust. Then, starting from the depth of the corners of the mouth, begin to shape the lip ridge. You can use compression or very small coils, or a combination of both, to create the lip ridge, which will generally be more prominent laterally and fade out medially. You will often find a subtle curve from the front plane of the upper lip into the depth of the corner of the mouth and out again to a slight depression above the lip ridge and below the full volume of the upper lip. Note that the lower lip sits within the lip ridge. Next, build up the primary sections of the lips. Typically, the upper lip will be divided into 3 sections, 1 medial mass below the philtrum and 2 lateral masses tapering out from it, while the bottom lip will be divided into 2 masses that meet in the middle. Use very small additions to build these up, as it will be easy to flood the mouth with clay. Be attentive to the way the lips curve in to meet at the opening of the mouth. The gentler this curve is, the more relaxed the mouth will seem. The more abrupt it is, the more tense the mouth will seem. One of the most effective ways to shape the inner masses of the lips is to compress out from their meeting point with a rubber compression tool. Once the primary masses are established and have stiffened up, you can delicately segment the lips using very small compression tools, loop tools, needle tools, and brushes. Check the definition of the nose, reasserting its anatomical structures if they've been refined away. Pay particular attention to the underside of the nose, where the wings, philtrum, and columella meet. As with the eyes and mouth, it can be good to slightly overemphasize the definition around the wings of the nose, both where they meet the cheeks and in the planar transition between their sides and undersides. Make sure that the flanks of the nose have sufficient volume. The fuller these are, the younger the face will appear. Like the nose, ears can sometimes get a little reduced in the refining passes, so build up their anatomical specificity, referring to images if you feel the need. Note that the curve of the helix is irregular in most ears, uneven in thickness, and with 1 or more turns or dips. And also that many ears, even young ones, have pronounced dimples where the cartilaginous structures meet the lobe. It's a good idea to sharpen the overhanging edge of the helix slightly to imply a greater thinness than the clay actually has, ensuring that the undercurve of the helix is lost in shadow. If the back of the ear isn't occluded by hair, check it too, making sure that the back of the concha and lobe transition correctly into the jawline and the volume of the mastoid process. Although for the purposes of clarity, I've here been covering each of the features separately. In practice, detailing is a much more holistic process in which you move around the bust, following whatever catches your eye, adjusting, correcting, defining, and refining as you go. Finalize the sectioning of the hair, adding sections that fall over the features and any smaller curls or strands. Define, refine, and redefine the sections until you're satisfied. Then texture the hair. To reiterate from part 12, texture should subtly amplify the motion and implied texture already established by the interplay of the sections. Typically, it's best to twist the texture around each section in counterpoint to its overall direction. Depending on the dryness of the clay, you can use very small ribbon tools, compression tools, dry, stiff bristle brushes, and/or needle tools if your touch is very light. Check all of the transitional structures between the features, making small additions or removals as necessary. Up to hard leather hard, it's still relatively safe to make small skim coat additions to build up the structures, but you have to make sure they're both thin and very thoroughly worked in, or they may delaminate during the drying and firing processes. Any drier than hard leather hard, and additions become much more risky. The last step before moving on to surfacing is to clean and compress the foot of the bust. This is probably the most commonly neglected detail in all of bust making, but how a sculpture meets the surface on which it rests is important, so do pay attention to it. In this instance, I've continued the shoulders down into the chest rather than cutting away to a sculptural base. However, I've simplified the anatomy refining it back in order to shift the emphasis towards the subject of this instructional series, the face and hair. I've compressed deeply around the foot, casting a dark shadow that separates the bust from the surface on which it rests. If I'd continued the sculpture down to a sharp termination, it would look more as if the figure was emerging from that surface, as if from a pool of water. There are many surfacing options for figurative sculpture. Sculptors who prefer a more gestural, painterly style often leave finger and tool marks in the surface. These can be actual byproducts of the sculpting process, or they can be selectively added back in after refinement. The pragmatic benefit of this is that you don't have to go through the long and laborious process of perfecting your surfaces. It is, however, still challenging to pull off well. The surface marks can't be haphazard, but must amplify the structures and support the emphasis and subordination of the focal points. Two of the most common and effective techniques are 1. Using serrated loop tools to contour hatch the anatomy, emphasizing its three-dimensionality, and 2. Using compression tools to facet the structures, breaking the light up into discrete value fields. Both of these techniques have direct analogs in painting and drawing. For those who prefer a higher degree of refinement, there are also a range of possibilities. One of the easiest is to stipple the surfaces with a sponge. This creates a low satin finish across which light will fall nicely. For a smoother surface, you can use a soft bristle brush. This surface can be left as it is, or when the clay is bone dry, or close to it, burnished to a fairly high shine using a soft cloth. If you go this route, know that the more refined you make the surfaces, the more any flaws that remain will stand out. This is why highly refined surfaces can take so long to execute. Hard leather hard clay can also be burnished directly using a smooth, hard, rounded tool such as a stone or the back of a spoon. But given the typical complexity of a bust, it is almost certain that there will be places this kind of tool can't reach. It will also result in a slightly faceted surface reminiscent of hammered metal. I encourage you to experiment with all of these surfacing options to find out what works best for you and for your particular sculpture. Note that, in general, more pronounced definition and more active surface textures will imply greater age, while softer definition and more refined surfaces will imply greater youth. Rendering realistic skin, including fine wrinkles, pores, gooseflesh, moles, and blemishes, is a time-consuming process, and I find the biggest risk to its successful execution is tedium. It's important to avoid the strong temptation to start rushing. Take your time, and it should be a straightforward and ultimately rewarding task. The principles for rendering realistic skin are much the same as for the bust in its entirety, only on a much smaller scale. That is, an ongoing cycle of definition, refinement, and redefinition. Start by defining the wrinkles, working from the largest down to the smallest. You can use compression, loop, and needle tools to define them, then refine back with brushes. A simple search will find many good reference images that you can use as guides to the typical layout of facial wrinkles. Work on pores next, which can be defined through carving or compression. Usually compression works better for smaller pores, carving for larger. It's important to note that pores stretch to conform to the tension in the skin, which generally runs parallel to the direction of the underlying muscles. These directions are called Langer or cleavage lines. Maps of them are easy enough to find online. Pores are also not uniform across the face. In places they're larger and more loosely packed, in others smaller and more densely packed. Again, I'd recommend looking up reference images to get an idea of their typical layout. You can also look at your own face in a magnifying mirror. Don't be alarmed if the pores look dramatically over-defined before the first refining pass. Sometimes pores are raised in gooseflesh, on a recently shaved neck, for instance. You can achieve this look by tucking a needle tool under the surface of the clay and gently lifting up, then very delicately smoothing back with a soft brush. Moles and blemishes are easy. Just add a fleck of clay and work it in. For a pockmark, carve in a small hole. Throughout the entire detailing and finishing processes, vary your lighting conditions to ensure that you're seeing everything that's in front of you. A hard raking light from high, mid, and low angles is particularly important for very refined or realistic surfaces. When you're satisfied, you can start drying the bust for firing. The slower it dries, the better. See my video wrapping up for more on controlled drying. Periodically check the seams to make sure they're not separating. If they are, work slip and soft clay thoroughly into the cracks. Don't worry too much if the cracks keep opening up. You can always fill them in with a sculpting putty after firing. Just make sure to work the seams more carefully next time you're building in clay. Once the bust is bone dry, that is, once it's no longer cool to the touch, it's time to put it in a kiln and fire it. And that's it, the basics of sculpting a bust in water-based clay. I want to reiterate that this is not even remotely the only way to go about sculpting a bust, nor would I claim it's unequivocally the best way. It's an approach designed to provide as quickly and unambiguously as possible a basic understanding of both the anatomical structures of the face and some of the most important figure sculpting principles. My hope is that it will serve as a strong foundation from which you can continue to develop your anatomical knowledge, your sculptural skill, and your own personal style. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep sculpting.